Hi, my name is Claire Burke, and this is my summary video for the cluster criticism paper. So to begin, I'm going to do a summary of the artifact that I chose and its context. So the artifact I chose was the painting called The Slave Ship by J.W.R. Turner, and the full name of the painting is Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. And the painting depicts just that. So within the painting there is a ship, and the setting of this ship is in the middle of the ocean, and there's a really pretty sunset on the right side of the picture. But then on the left side of the painting, it depicts a storm coming on, or a typhoon, and it's a lot of like ominous coloring. So dark hues of purple, black, and red are all on the left side, and then there's brighter oranges and reds and yellows on the right side with the sunset. And the water on the ocean, it appears choppy and rough, and there's an array of like dark and light colors within the water. And there are also dead bodies of slaves who have been thrown overboard by the slavers on the ship. And this painting was created in 1840, and this is really at the peak of some of the darkest years in the United States regarding slavery. And it was when slaves were treated incredibly harshly, and they weren't seen as humans but more as property. And so this scene is depicting a slave ship that was most likely carrying slaves from Africa to America, and they are throwing the slaves overboard in an attempt to get insurance. So if they had lost the slaves on their own, they wouldn't receive any insurance and get paid back for the slaves, but if the slaves had died in traveling, then the slave masters would get insurance back. So that's what they're trying to do in the storm, is not lose themselves, not die themselves, so they're lightening the load, and then also attempting to get insurance by killing the slaves, by throwing them overboard. And so this painting is really important to study because it kind of sheds light further on the issues of slavery and what it was like back in 1840, and then also kind of reveals the worldview of the writer himself in the way he expresses this scene. So the method I used to analyze this artifact was the cluster criticism method, and this method has the three main steps associated with it, which is identifying the key terms, and then about 5 to 6 of those, and then finding ideas that cluster around those key terms. And then the final step is seeing how the key terms and the clustering provides the overall meaning of the artifact. So I applied this method to the piece of art, and I changed it slightly since you can't use keywords for painting. So I use colors, images, shapes, and lighting as my key terms, and then I found other colors that were associated with those images and just the overall shades of each of those to do for the clustering. And then finally, after that, I analyzed the key themes and those clusters and deducted on the true meaning behind this artifact, and also the worldview of J.W.R. Turner as the writer and how it was established from this analysis. So after that, the summary of my findings of my analysis. So the first term that I established these terms actually: the slave ship, the slaves in the water, the sunset and storm, and then the people remaining on the ship. And then with each of those, I clustered around just the coloring. So with the slave ship, the colors are black, red, purple, and there are choppy waters surrounding the ship. And so this picture, it kind of creates a scene of anger and malice and revenge, with the dark colors representing the dark things that have occurred on the ship, and then the choppy waters kind of reveal like the tumult and chaos that has ensued because of the storm. And this kind of showcases the evil of the slave trade and the death that is caused in the dark colors. And then the slaves in the water are clustered with colors of maroon, black, and tan, and then there's birds flying around them as well. And this kind of depicts the idea of death that has occurred, with the maroon waters signifying the blood that is being spilled by them being thrown overboard, and then the black color of the waters represents death and as it's happening to the slaves. And then the birds indicate also the dead bodies and them pecking at their remains, and just further illustrates the death that is shown, and the theme behind it of how the slave trade treated people as less than human, since they were viewed as just property that could be easily tossed overboard to make money. And then the sunset, which lies directly above the dying slaves, its colors feature yellows, whites, oranges, and red, so it's much brighter than the rest of the painting. And so this kind of gives the feeling of hope for the dying slaves, and the choppiest for the dying slaves, and the idea of something better is coming for them. Even though death is present, there's still the idea that something's on the horizon and coming for them in a new day. So then after that, I analyzed the storm, and the colors that cluster around this storm is black, dark red, dark purple, and then hues of gray coloring. And then the waters are the choppiest on this side of the painting, and the ship is on top of these colors. And then the ship also appears to be heading into the storm. So this gives a picture of the idea that the evil that is happening on the ship with all the dark colors surrounding it. And then another key term that I looked at was the people that were still on board the ship. So that and the storm together kind of illustrate the darkest part, or most evil, is occurring on the ship with the people aboard. And then it also shows that the storm is happening to both the slaves and the slave masters, making no distinction between them. So the only difference between the two, the slave masters and the slave, is the coloring around each, with the people on the ship being painted in darker colors. So this kind of illustrates that there's no distinction between them, which was not common with the slave trade. As I stated earlier, that slaves were seen as less than human. So it depicts that there's no difference between them, but that the evil is happening on board the ship with the slave masters. And then, so when analyzing how this work of art adds to rhetorical theory, it is evident that it shows the worldview of the writer, so J.W.R. Turner. So it's clear that Turner did not agree with the horrors of the slave trade that was very common in his time, being in 1840. And then he explains this through the use of dark, ominous coloring, as I pointed out, and then the emphasis on the cruelty of there's limbs and hands coming out of the water. It just depicts the horrors. So, and it also further shows that he didn't think the slave masters were above the slaves, but were equal to them in the fact that the storm was affecting all the people in the painting. And then it also seems to suggest that there are dark days ahead for the slave masters with the approaching storm and the ship heading into it. And then, although the slaves are the ones suffering in the picture, there's a beautiful sunset behind them. So it kind of gives the idea that amid such chaos, there's hope to the situation, and that there could be a change, and there's a potential new day, not one filled with cruelty and hatred. So that was my summary video, and kind of just how the work adds to rhetorical theory, and then how it can be applied to our everyday life of just the horrors of slavery, and better understanding that time period, and also the worldview of J.W.R. Turner. Thank you.